realization, I think, that everybody's contribution was equally critically important, and therefore, next step, why not have everyone who is an adult that's got a working brain get to participate in politics? There wasn't this sort of sense that, like, oh, well, we're going to keep our women nice and separate and pristine away from the crazy areas of politics. What event occurred shortly prior to the 19th Amendment being finally proposed by Congress, 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and 3/4 of the states ratifying? World War I. And what contribution did women in the United States of America make with respect to World War I? More than that. The men were off fighting, and the women were in the factory playing baseball. Oh my God, that's a league of our own. That's World War II, by the way. And you'll get this next year when we do World War I. You can put this down. The women were in the factories. They needed the women in the factories. The women were making huge contributions to the ability of the United States to field a military, an army with equipment, with guns, with supplies. Women were in the factories. That was not their traditional role necessarily. Oh no, there was African American women working in factories and so forth too. Oh, trust me. Just because you're in favor of women's rights doesn't mean you're necessarily in favor of civil rights for African Americans. Isn't that ironic? Yeah, I loved it because, John Adams was like, America should be free, and his wife Abigail's writing to him like, don't forget the women too. And he's like, oh, aren't you sweet, Abigail? And she's like, Yeah. It's only been 100 years since we've had the 19th Amendment and women's vote rights. Okay? The interesting thing was, did this really change the outcome of elections? Not that much, because are there more, we'll get to this more in our last unit on politics, are women vastly more conservative or liberal than men? Not necessarily, yeah. There's going to be a different take on it. We'll come back to it a little bit later, but a little bit of a different take. Are women smart enough to handle the responsibilities of political decision-making? Are men? Are 18-year-olds? Well, you want to repeal the 26th Amendment? You're old enough to fight, but you're not old enough to vote? Anyway. That's the 26th Amendment, anyway. All right, here's the 26th Amendment. Let's get to this one. 26th Amendment, I don't know if there's been too many states prior to that time that allowed 18-year-olds to vote. This is one that most of the states were pretty much stuck at 21 as the age. So the 26th Amendment was very, very important. I mean, it granted vote rights to a large group of people that previously didn't have it. What event was going on in the 1960s that kind of helped to move and get the 26th Amendment? The Vietnam War. Write that down. If you were a young man, and this was the last time we had the draft. I mean, men could volunteer. My father-in-law, he joined the United States Marine Corps and was in several tours of duty during the Vietnam War. He joined. If you were a young man and you're not headed to college or you didn't have any other draft deferment kind of thing, at age 18 you're eligible to be drafted, sent over to fight in the Vietnam War. Okay? But when could you vote? 21. So the argument was, and it ultimately prevailed, if you're old enough to fight for your country and die for your country, old enough to help elect the people who are going to make those decisions. Yeah. So the irony is, now you're like, well, that means I get my full package of adult rights when I turn 18, right? There's one that's been kicked down the road for about 3 years. The drinking one, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're a United States serviceman or woman and you're serving the United States military and you're on a base in Germany and so forth, can you drink a beer? Heck, yeah, your little kid brother could drink a beer because the drinking age is like 12. I don't know, it's not 12. I think it's like 16. You know? So, it's very, very young. Yeah. All right, any questions relative to the 26th Amendment? Okay? Again, can a state or community give more voting rights to a younger age population if they wanted to? Yes, they could. And I want to say, because I've been following this closely when I was teaching at Capitol High School, there were some students who were seniors, and they're like, we have to take government as a senior, and if we have to take government and so forth, why should we have to wait until we're 18 and probably, close to or having finished high school before we can actually vote? And so they got it together. They proposed a bill. It went to the Idaho legislature. It went to committee. They got a hearing, and they got a hearing. These are my high school students. They got a hearing. Well, here's what they heard. Here's what they heard. You're right, they died. But here's what they heard from the members of the committee. It was a little patronizing. I mean, have you ever been around adults that are kind of patronizing, like, oh, aren't you clever? Aren't you clever? You're like way ahead of your time. You're like, shut up. So they were like, oh, aren't you clever? Aren't you clever? You're putting together this bill and you're proposing voting rights for 17-year-olds. And, oh, aren't you just really special? And basically the message they received was, you're exceptional. Most of the people your age aren't really like that. So they defeated the bill. Now here's the irony. A lot of times if you lose on a bill, you come back. You come back. Is that particular group of Capitol High students going to go back then the following year to try and get that bill through? Yeah, they're 18. They're off, college or doing whatever. There's not as much of that incentive to do that. This might be of interest to you. And this isn't necessarily a given. Which political party, Republican or Democrat, might be a little bit more open to having 16 or 17-year-olds vote? And I've noticed it is a little bit more Democrat, although generally what you get in a population is, and we'll see this again in the next unit, is you get more of the same. If you got an area that's predominantly Republican and you have 16, 17-year-olds voting, they're going to be typically voting like their parents, okay, for the most part. It varies. It varies. But I would say right now the Democrats are pushing it a little bit more, but it's not a big, huge thing going on in the country. Okay? All right. Now, poll tax. Let's look at the poll tax. Let me give you the facts of the poll tax. This is back to discrimination against African Americans. In the Deep South, one of the ways that the Southern whites used to prevent African Americans from actually trying to vote, besides simple intimidation like, really? You're going to try and register? You're going to try and vote? Intimidation. We're going to fire you. We're going to make things really hard for you. We're going to do all kinds of various different things. One of the legal methods is to create a poll tax. Write this down. Basically, in order to be eligible to vote, you have to pay a tax. That make sense? Now, on the face of it, it doesn't look discriminatory. It looks like it applies to everyone. Do white people have to pay the poll tax according to the law? It looks like that, yeah. In fact, this was one of those ones, if on closer inspection, if you looked at it, it was being used predominantly to make it hard for African Americans to vote. Basically, kind of two ways. One, there wasn't as much of a real enforcement of making sure that the whites paid it. Have you ever had a sibling that seems to be able to get away with not following the same rules in the household that are enforced on you? Max is opening his eyes big and wide and so forth. Doesn't that just give you a self of righteous indignation, and you're just like, mm. Well, that's where African Americans were coming from, right? They're like, man. And they would try and actually go to pay the poll tax because they didn't want that to be an impediment to them actually voting. They'd show up to pay the poll tax, and it wouldn't be open. The paperwork would be lost. It'd be come back another day. It was another opportunity for, the official government people to sort of look at them and go, seriously, you're trying to do this? And this is going on, from the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, all the way up into the 1960s. Why not after the 1960s? Because of the Civil Rights Movement, and one of the things that came out of the Civil Rights Movement was the 24th Constitutional Amendment. Poll taxes are no longer allowed anywhere. So therefore, that's one impediment to preventing African Americans from voting. Does that make sense? Okay? Clarification? Okay. Here was another thing. Oh, and by the way, this is one of the issues that's with us now. It's also very, very controversial. I'm going to dive right into this one. Is requiring proof photo identification in order to vote a racist impediment to prevent African Americans or people of color from voting? Depending on who you talk to, some folks would say yes, and other folks would say no. Okay? But it is at the heart of some of the debates that are going on right now as far as voting laws. What do you need to have when you go to vote if you are voting physically in person or go to register to vote? Some folks are saying photo ID is discriminatory against African Americans. Others are saying, no, it's not at all. It's not discriminatory against African Americans. It helps to reduce fraud, for example. Okay? So we'll see how that kind of plays around. It's not as, poll tax was discriminatory for sure in how it was being carried out. Photo ID requirements and so forth, depending on who you talk to, you could get a variety of different answers. Question, comment? Okay. Anybody want to chime in on that one? All right. Some folks would say the argument is that African American communities, people of color and so forth, have a harder time getting photo identification. It's a real hassle. Other folks will come back and go, look, if you want to get in an airplane, you've got to get a photo ID. I mean, photo ID is kind of ubiquitous, that people are using it all over the place and so forth. So that's the retort. It's kind of like, it's not that hard. Potentially, yeah. I mean, you could expand the range of different kinds of things that you could use as a form of photo identification. If you don't drive, so you don't have a driver's license, can you still vote? Of course you can vote. So what do you have to get? You got to get some kind of a photo identification in order to show that's you, right? And here's the deal. You know what they're going to make you take off when you get your picture taken for a driver's license or some other kind of photo identification? Exactly, your glasses. And clearly you're going to have to take off the mask too because, they want to, yeah, so like say we want to get a passport picture, a driver's license and so forth, you got to take off the glasses, which is really weird because when I look, yeah, it's like when I look at my driver's license, it's like, oh look, there's Mr. Hansen without glasses. It looks like I just woke up or something. Whoa! Woo! There we go. No, I know, that's actually not a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, they're going to empty my bank accounts now. Okay. It does. Trust me, and it felt weird. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll just destroy that. Okay? Yes. Okay, I'll just delete it. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Initially, you have to pay more if it's a replacement. Is it really? I thought it was more than that. For you. Yeah, it's not that much. It's a processing fee. All right, here we go. This was another method that was used in the Deep South to prevent and discourage African Americans from voting. Literacy tests. Let's talk about that. Literacy tests. Because, as you can see here, trick question, what was the constitutional amendment that got rid of literacy tests? There wasn't one. Well, look at the handout. What prevented literacy tests from being used by states as a prerequisite from being able to vote? Exactly. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 with amendments in 1970. The 65 Voting Rights Act was huge in the civil rights movement. That was the one that Martin Luther King Jr. was focusing on when he was trying to, for example, the famous march from Selma to Montgomery. Lots of violence, lots of intensity, lots of all kinds of, it was huge. But ultimately, Congress and then the president, Lyndon Johnson, signed the act banning literacy tests. You're like, what the heck is a literacy test? That's where you have to prove that you're smart before you can vote. Okay? That's where you have to prove that you're literate before you can vote. Now, I suppose the rationale on its face kind of makes sense because, frankly, I don't want you guys voting unless you know who's on the ballot, unless you've done your homework. I don't want you just walking in on the day of the election and going, I don't know, you know, or just voting on the basis of like what political party, because if it's the Ada County Highway District, my brother's name is not next to Democrat or Republican. It's just his name. It's just a bunch of names. Right? If you're voting for judges in the state of Idaho, it's just names. No party identification. Do your homework. And it's not easy. Okay? On certain things, yeah, like judges in Idaho and a lot of the local officials and so forth, the ones that are like party identification is like Congress and state legislature and so forth, and county offices, a lot of them are party. But here's the deal. Literacy test, basically, on its face, it's just like, if you can prove that you're literate, then you can register to vote. Well, here's the problem. Write this down. It was not consistent, and it was not fair in the Deep South. It was very subject to the feeling of the person carrying out the test. And that's like, ugh, I hate that vagueness. It's like, ugh, you can prove you're literate. Well, what do you do? Well, if a white person would come in and they weren't really, frankly, very literate and so forth, what would they need to do? Not much to meet the satisfaction of the local white registrar. Okay? Careful. If an African American came in to register to vote and was subject to a literacy test, here's a typical literacy test. The registrar would give you a section of the Constitution from the state, and then you'd have to read it aloud and then interpret it to the satisfaction of the registrar. You know, something that might have been written in the 1700s or the 1800s that, you know, even lawyers could have a disagreement as to whatever that was. So if you can imagine a college professor at an African-American college in South Carolina or Georgia or Alabama or so forth going in to try to register to vote, and the person looks at him and basically is like, really? You're here? We have to go through this? All right, go ahead, read it. Oh, that's nice. Now interpret it. That's just not going to do it. Get on out of here. You got that? So that's how literacy tests were actually carried out to prevent African Americans from voting. But they're all gone as of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was a big deal. That was a huge, huge victory. That was one that they were working very, very hard for. Because once African Americans can vote, do they have more power over what's going on in their communities? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay? There was also some weird things like grandfather clauses, which are really kind of stupid on their faces. They got rid of those. Like, if your grandfather was able to vote, then you can. You're like, well, my grandfather was a slave. Well, there you go. That is dumb. Yeah. So, I mean, it's like, so some of those impediments are going to be moving on. Questions about voting. Okay, we'll come back to the particulars of voting when we get to the politics unit, which is the last unit. Let's get to the First Amendment. Ooh. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on the First Amendment. First Amendment is good. There's all kinds of different component parts of the First Amendment. We'll be talking about First Amendment with respect to speech and expression, freedom of the press, and so forth. And we'll also ultimately get into issues having to do with religion. And yeah, it's good stuff. Okay? It's good stuff. Now, just a reminder, because you have First Amendment rights for speech and expression and so forth, are they absolute? Okay? They're relative. And one of the famous quotes that came out of the Supreme Court case, the judge was like, you do not have the right to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Not that those things exist anymore and so forth, but nevertheless, if you're in a crowded movie theater, you can't yell fire. Well, actually, one exception. If there's a fire, exactly. If you're like, I'm going to tell a joke. It's a good joke. I just want to see what's going to happen. In fact, it's a science experiment. I want to see how many people are going to run up and rush to the door. And then I want to count the number of people that are crushed en route. I'm just really interested in that. Do you have a right? I mean, that's just words. It's just words. Words never hurt anybody. You got the right to say whatever you want, right? No, because the justice would point out, there's your First Amendment rights, ding, 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 ding. On the other side of the scale is their interest in actually not being crushed to death by some idiot who is trying to have a joke. Okay? What if you go into a firehouse? Can you yell, move it? Just kidding, don't. That's ridiculous. Okay. All right, now, there's all kinds of things. I'm going to take you through this. You're going to want to either take a picture or write this down, because this has actually been a work in progress. This is Mr. Hansen's sort of accumulated list of analysis that the Supreme Court has used over many years and many cases, and it basically gives you this sense of a variety of different protection levels. Exactly. If you look at those, you're like, that makes sense. Oh, yeah, that definitely makes sense. In other words, some kinds of expression and speech are going to be more highly protected than others. And some, the one at the bottom, no protection whatsoever. If you have on your phone a file that is deemed to be pornographic relative to children, you're in big trouble. Okay? There is no like, oh, I'm just expressing. No. Because who is the victim there? Children. And how are they trying to protect the victims? By cutting off all avenues of child pornography, by punishing all the people that are associated with that. So be careful with that. Understand that. I'll go through this very quickly, and then we'll be doubling back and giving you some examples and playing out some different scenarios as we go through the rest of today and into the next time we come together. The very highest levels of protection are going to be speech, expression that has to do with politics and religion. We're going to see that those are very, very highly protected. Politics, we're a democracy. Hello. Let people express their political points of view, even if you don't agree with them. They'll be like, oh, you're hurting my ears. You're talking like a, fill in the blank, a Democrat, a Republican, a Trump supporter, a Biden supporter. I'm like, whatever. Deal with it. You know? It's politics. If we're going to be a democracy, how are we going to make wise decisions unless we hear lots of stuff? So there's going to be a lot of protection for political speech, okay? Religious expression. The First Amendment is also going to have a protection for religious expression. We are not a country that has just one set religion and all the others can go take a hike. We got a lot of choice, just like in politics. We got a lot of choice with respect to religion. None is held up higher than others, so let's just let people express their religious perspectives and so forth. And then make your choices, make your decisions. Now, where this is going to get interesting, I've got a great case for you. Oh my gosh. Because sometimes it's a mixture. Sometimes you're going to have like religious expression tied in with something that's like less expression. I kid you not. There is a case coming. I'm going to present it to you. It has to do with some Alaska high school students, or maybe middle school students. Anyway, they were holding up a sign that said, "Bong hits for Jesus."
That's sick.
A bong hit is associated with the, marijuana. Okay? Jesus is the pivotal person associated with Christianity. Duh. Okay? So it's like, when you have a mixture, how is that going to play out? Those create some really interesting things. Is the higher one going to pull the lesser protected speech up for greater protection, or is the lower one going to drag the other one down for lesser protection? Take a look. Commercial and artistic are going to be very highly valued in this country as well. After all, we're a free market enterprise. It's America. As President Calvin Coolidge once said, President number 30, the business of America is business. Yeah, he did. Yeah, I mean, actually, business. Okay? I mean, that's cool. So it's like commercial opportunities and so forth, and yet you're like, please, do we have to have like some loud carnival singer, going through my neighborhood? Can we like limit that and so forth? It's going to be highly protected, but maybe not as highly protected as political and religious. Artistic expression. That's a fun one. artistic. We want creative things. We want all kinds of creativity to come out there and express themselves and so forth. But be careful when your artistic starts to get into something that's like, I mean, some people's artistic, another person's like, that's just plain obscene. That is obscene, obscene, and obscene. Well, take your pick. It's an interesting dynamic as we go through there. Because literally, you're going to have some people down here go, that's artistic, and other folks are going to go, I don't think so. I mean, your naked baby pictures, is that artistic? Is that protected? If the parents have that on their cell phones, is that going to be right in here as far as child pornography? You're like, no, it's just a naked baby. They're a child. You're like, oh my gosh, when is nudity something that is obscene as opposed, because obscene is going to be less protected for sure, and when is it artistic? Michelangelo! Is it artistic? Because it's Italian and it's on a church ceiling. But when is it not artistic? When is it born? Oh my gosh, we're going to have to get into those kinds of things? Yeah, all right, here's some more definitions for you as we're laying this thing out. Some protection in certain circumstances among some people. There's going to be some age differentiation here, right? Adults are going to have more opportunity to kind of like share some of this stuff than with respect to little kids and so forth. Defamatory. Here's a definition for that real quick. Somebody has said something about you that ruins your reputation. It is false, and it ruins your reputation. Okay, you got that? Or they should know that it's false. They were just being careless. That's not going to be really highly protected stuff. But if it's true, sucks to be you. It's not defamatory. Okay? Some things that are illegal, like promoting illegal activities. Right? Can you walk around with a T-shirt that says "Buy pot in Oregon" while you're in Oregon? Yeah. It's commercial and it's legal. What about in Idaho? Ew. It's "Buy pot in Oregon." Oh my gosh. You're like, wait a minute. It's legal in Oregon, but it's in Idaho. I mean, anyway. So it does create an interesting little thing. Obscene. When is something obscene? You want a definition? I mean, literally, you're going to get some judges going, I know it's obscene when I see it. Well, what are we going to have to do to like get a little bit more specificity so that we all know like what standard? Have you ever heard of the word prurient? I can't even pronounce that. Prurient. Courts are going to say that if material appeals to your prurient interests, it's not protected as much, as opposed to it's artistic. It's just a beautiful human body. It creates a sense of, oh no! It's not love, it's lust. It's base human sexual desire. And if it creates that in a human being, then it's not as highly protected. It's obscene. You got that? Wow, what a place to stop. I guess this is probably a good place to clean up the desks. Yeah. Oh my God. I hope my thing is not visible because I'm going to have to fix that for sure.